Lorenzo Moretti slid the divorce papers across the polished mahogany table and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a regretful one. The kind a man smiles when he's already won, when the outcome was decided in a room the other person was never invited into. He smoothed his lapel with one finger, glanced at his attorney, and then looked at his wife, the way you look at something you're about to throw away. "Sign it," he said. "We both know you don't have a choice." Isabella Moretti picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. That surprised him. He'd expected tears, maybe shaking. Some version of the woman he'd spent 11 years training to need him. Instead, she signed her name in 3 clean strokes, set the pen down on top of the document, and stood up without saying a single word. Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, comfortable, satisfied. He had no idea that the woman walking out of that room wasn't leaving in defeat. She was leaving to survive, and survival for Isabella Moretti was only the beginning. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like you were disappearing, this story is for you. Stay until the end. What Lorenzo lost the day he let her walk away will cost him everything he ever built. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single moment of this story. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. The morning of the divorce, Isabella woke up at 5:43. She didn't set an alarm. She hadn't slept past 6 in years, not in this apartment, not in this life. Penthouse was the kind of place that felt expensive, even in the dark. Cool marble under bare feet, the faint hum of the city 22 floors below. A closet full of clothes she had stopped choosing for herself somewhere around year 4 of her marriage. She showered, dressed, and made herself a cup of coffee she didn't finish. Lorenzo was already gone. He'd stopped sleeping in their bedroom 18 months ago, around the time Bianca Romano became a permanent feature of his schedule. He never admitted it outright. Lorenzo wasn't the admitting type. He preferred the architecture of plausible deniability, the elegant fiction of a husband who traveled for business and came home smelling like someone else's perfume. Isabella had known. She'd known for a long time. Knowing and doing something about it were 2 different countries, and crossing the border had taken her longer than she was proud of. She stood at the window with her coffee going cold, watching headlights cut through the early gray below. November. The city had that particular winter morning quality, muted and slightly exhausted, like it hadn't decided yet whether to commit to the day. She felt that too. The familiar low-grade numbness she'd learned to function inside. Her phone buzzed. Her attorney, Daniel Crane, confirming the 9 o'clock appointment at the firm. She texted back, "I'll be there." Simple. Direct. 2 words that felt more honest than anything she'd said out loud in months. The thing people don't understand about marriages like Isabella's is that they don't collapse all at once. There's no dramatic moment where everything breaks. Slower than that. It's 1,000 small surrenders, opinions you stop voicing because it's easier, friends who fade because you made dinners uncomfortable, versions of yourself you quietly retire because they made him impatient. You don't notice it happening. Then one day you look in the mirror and you recognize the face but not the expression behind it, and you realize you've been performing a role so long you've forgotten what you were like before the curtain went up. Isabella remembered exactly when she'd started forgetting. The gallery. 3 years into their marriage, she'd been running a small but respected contemporary art gallery in the meatpacking district. It wasn't a vanity project. She'd built it from a concept and 2 borrowed connections into something that mattered to people who cared about emerging artists. She was good at it. She understood the space between what a piece of art said and what a buyer needed to hear, and she could hold both things at once in a way most people couldn't. Lorenzo had found it inconvenient, not immediately. At first he was supportive in the performative way of powerful men who liked the idea of a wife with her own thing. It made him look generous, modern, secure. But as his business dealings grew more complex and the dinner parties more frequent and the life more consuming, the gallery became a scheduling problem. Then an embarrassment. Then finally, the subject of a very calm, very quiet conversation in their kitchen on a Tuesday evening in which Lorenzo explained, without raising his voice, that certain of his associates were uncomfortable with the public profile her work was creating, and that it would be better for everyone if she stepped back. She'd closed the gallery within the month. She told herself it was temporary. that she'd reopen it somewhere lower profile, that she wasn't giving it up, just pausing. She never went back. The morning wore on. She finished dressing, checked her bag twice the original signed copies of her prenuptial agreement that her own attorney had reviewed, not Lorenzo's, and took the elevator down to street level where a car was waiting. She'd arranged it herself, paid for it from a separate account she'd quietly maintained for 2 years. $40 of deliberate independence she hadn't told anyone about. It felt, getting into that car, like the most significant $40 she'd ever spent. The ride to the firm was 20 minutes. She spent most of it looking out the window, not thinking about much. Trying not to. The conference room at Crane & Associates was on the 14th floor, northeast corner, with a view of a glass office tower that reflected the clouds. Lorenzo was already there when she arrived, which meant he'd made a point of arriving first. He always had to arrive first. It was a dominance thing, occupying the room before you did so. You were always entering his space, never the other way around. He looked good. He always looked good. Dark suit, charcoal, perfectly fitted. Silver hair, he'd stopped fighting 3 years ago when it started making him look distinguished instead of old. Jaw that was still sharp, eyes that were pale and quick, and gave away nothing he didn't choose to give away. He didn't stand when she walked in. His attorney, Marcus Webb, nodded at her. Webb was the kind of lawyer who'd been hired specifically because he made opposing parties feel outnumbered. Wide-shouldered, slow-blinking, with the practiced calm of someone who'd been in enough of these rooms to know that discomfort was a negotiating tool. Daniel Crane, her attorney, was already seated. He gave her a look the kind that communicated, "We've prepared for this. Stay with me," and she sat down beside him. The papers were already on the table. Lorenzo's team had prepared them. 47 pages of their 11 years, reduced to legal language and distribution schedules. What was his? What was hers? Mostly his. The penthouse, his. The investment portfolio they'd held jointly, his, because her name had been quietly removed from the primary documentation in a filing she hadn't been notified about until 3 weeks ago. The personal accounts she'd contributed to throughout the marriage, substantially depleted, transfers she hadn't authorized that Webb's team had a very thorough and very confident explanation for. Daniel had fought every point he could fight. He'd recovered what he could. What remained for Isabella after 11 years was a settlement that would have been insulting to a woman who'd married a man with $100,000 and a corner apartment, let alone a man whose organization moved the kind of money Lorenzo's did. She'd understood, looking at the final numbers, that this wasn't just a divorce. It was an erasure. Lorenzo caught her eye across the table. He smiled that same comfortable smile from 1,000 dinner parties, the one that made strangers feel included and made Isabella feel like something small and categorized. "Ready?" he said. The word had a specific weight to it. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder. This is my room, my timeline, my outcome. She picked up the pen. He watched her sign with the expression of a man watching a transaction complete. His attorney shuffled papers. Lorenzo reached for his own copy, signed without reading it, because he already knew what it said, because his people had written every word, and then he leaned back and checked his watch. He had somewhere to be. She'd seen that watch 100 times. Matte black face, thin bezel, the kind of watch that cost more than most people's cars, and was specifically designed to not look like it did. He'd bought it on a trip to Geneva 2 years ago. He'd bought a matching bracelet for someone else on the same trip, which she'd discovered 3 months later when the receipt came through a shared card account he'd forgotten she had access to. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and said something to Webb in a low voice she wasn't meant to hear. Then he looked at her one more time, that pale, quick, dismissive look, and walked out. No goodbye. Not even the performance of one. Daniel touched her arm. "Isabella." She was still looking at the door. "We can appeal the asset transfers. It'll take time, but I know." She picked up her copy of the agreement and put it in her bag. "Thank you, Daniel." She walked out of the building at 9:47 in the morning. The November air hit her cold, sharp, carrying the smell of exhaust, and something that might have been rain later. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, bag over her shoulder, not sure which direction to start walking. She was 41 years old. She had $4,200 in a personal account, a settlement that wouldn't cover 6 months of the life she'd been living, and a name that now meant nothing, except that she used to be married to someone dangerous. She started walking. She made it half a block. The black SUV pulled up alongside her slowly, keeping pace with her stride. It was armored. She recognized the profile, the thickness of the windows, the way it sat heavy on its suspension. The kind of vehicle that certain kinds of men used when they needed to have conversations that couldn't be overheard. Stopped. The rear door opened. A man stepped out. He was in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of decisions made in difficult rooms. He wore a dark overcoat, no tie. His hands were large, and he held them open, a deliberate gesture, she realized. Visible, non-threatening. The movement of someone who understood how to approach a frightened person. Isabella, he said, "My name is Nico Valenti. I knew your father." She looked at him. The name hit somewhere she hadn't expected. Her father had been dead for 6 years. She hadn't heard anyone say his name in connection with their own in a very long time. "I know what Lorenzo has done," Nico said, "and I know what he's planning to do next." "You need to hear it." The wind picked up. A newspaper page scraped along the gutter. Isabella looked at the car, then back at Nico. She was aware of how this looked: a woman who'd just signed divorce papers from a Mafia boss, getting into a vehicle with a man she'd never met, on the street, within sight of anyone who might be watching. She was also aware that she'd spent 11 years making the safe choice. She got in. The door closed. The car moved into traffic. Nico sat across from her in the back seat. There was a second man in the front passenger seat who didn't turn around. The divider between the seats was half up. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Then Nico said, "Do you know why Lorenzo moved so quickly on the divorce?" "Because of Bianca," Isabella said. Nico shook his head. "Bianca is a distraction. She always was. Lorenzo isn't moving fast because he wants to start a new life." He reached into his coat and removed a folded sheet of paper. He set it on the seat between them. "He's moving fast because the Carbone family and the Ricci organization have both sent people to audit his books. $38 million is missing from joint fund allocations that were supposed to move through 3 different holding structures in the last 14 months. Isabella didn't touch the paper. "What does that have to do with me?" "The transfers were processed using your digital signature," Nico said. "Your credentials, your name. The paper trail as it currently exists leads to an account that was opened in your name in 2021 that you have never heard of." The car made a turn. Outside, the city moved past, indifferent. Isabella kept her voice level. "I never opened any account in 2021. "I know that." Nico's voice was even. No drama in it, which somehow made it worse. "Lorenzo knows that. His financial people built the trail specifically. Clean enough to pass a first-level audit. Deep enough to raise questions at a second one." He paused. The divorce was the first step. The next step, when the Carbone and Ricci auditors finished their review, is Lorenzo presenting evidence to both families that the discrepancies originate with his former wife, a woman who has already been cut off, who had access to his organization's records, who's every reason to steal. Isabella was quiet. The mathematics of it assembled themselves in her mind, piece by piece. Lorenzo moving quickly on the settlement. The asset transfers she hadn't been told about. The deliberate depletion of accounts. All of it working together to paint a picture of a desperate woman who'd been skimming money from her husband's organization for years before he finally caught on and threw her out. "He needs a scapegoat," she said. "He needs someone specific and credible," Nico said. "You're both." She pressed her fingertips against her knee. Hard. Grounding. "Why are you telling me this?" Nico looked at her for a long moment. "Because your father was one of the few men in this world I genuinely trusted. And because what Lorenzo did to get where he is and what he buried to stay there involves your family in ways you have a right to know." He said it without sentiment. It wasn't a comfort offer. It was a statement of fact, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. "We'll talk more when we get there." She looked out the window. Safe. She tried to remember the last time she'd felt that. The safe house was a brownstone on a quiet block in Carroll Gardens, the kind of building that looked like 12 other buildings on the same street, which was the point. Nico had a set of keys. The first floor was bare except for furniture that had the clean, unlived-in quality of a place maintained rather than used. They sat in the kitchen. Someone made coffee. Nobody forced it on her. Nico put 3 folders on the table. "I want to be clear about something," he said before he opened them. I'm not here to recruit you into anything. I'm not asking you to take any action. I'm giving you information that I believe you're entitled to, and after I give it, what you do with it is your decision." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. It was warm. That helped a little. "All right," she said. He opened the first folder. Financial records. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. She'd spent 11 years watching Lorenzo's world from its edges, and she'd absorbed more than he realized. She could read a transfer structure. She could recognize when a signature had been duplicated. She could see in the rows of dates and account numbers exactly where her name had been inserted into a chain of transactions she'd had nothing to do with. It was meticulous work, patient, the kind of construction that had taken months, maybe longer. He opened the second folder, documents, legal agreements. Some she recognized fragments of the prenuptial language, documents from early in her marriage that she'd signed and filed and trusted. Others she'd never seen. One in particular caught her eye, a single-page agreement dated 11 years ago, 1 week before her wedding to Lorenzo. Her father's signature at the bottom. "What is this?" she said. Nico was quiet for a moment. "Then your father was a careful man. He'd known Lorenzo's family for years, long enough to know what Lorenzo's operation actually was, beneath the legitimate businesses." He tapped the edge of the page. "Before the wedding, your father conducted his own investigation. He discovered that Lorenzo had been diverting money from the Moretti family's collective fund, not small amounts, Isabella. Substantial sums moved into private accounts that Lorenzo controlled personally and that his own family didn't know about." She looked at the page, her father's handwriting, the careful, slightly slanted cursive she'd grown up reading on birthday cards and grocery lists. "He could have stopped the wedding," Nico said. "He considered it. But your father also knew that making a direct move against Lorenzo at that point would have put you in a dangerous position, the daughter of the man who'd exposed him. So instead he did something quieter. He documented everything he'd found and secured it, and he drafted an agreement with a specific legal provision." Nico tapped the page again. "It stipulates that in the event Lorenzo Moretti is found to have committed financial fraud against parties connected to the Moretti organization or against his own wife, all assets acquired by Lorenzo using diverted funds during the period of those diversions become subject to a rightful claim by Isabella Moretti as the direct heir of the man who discovered the fraud." The kitchen was very quiet. "He protected me," Isabella said. Not a question, not quite a statement, something between the two. "He protected you the only way he could, without putting you in immediate danger," Nico said. "He buried the agreement where Lorenzo wouldn't find it, or so he believed. But Lorenzo found it. 6 months after your father died," Nico confirmed. "He had people go through everything. He found the document, understood what it meant, and buried it further. He spent 6 years making sure it stayed buried. He closed the folder. He also spent 6 years making sure that if the document ever surfaced, there would be a very clear reason to dismiss it, a discredited wife, with a documented history of financial misconduct within the organization." Isabella set her coffee down. She thought about her father. The last conversation she'd had with him a Sunday afternoon. His kitchen, the kind of late fall light that turned everything amber. He'd been quieter than usual. She'd thought he was tired. He'd hugged her when she left, held on a moment longer than he usually did, and said, "You're stronger than you know." Bella, which was something he said sometimes. His particular variety of fatherly encouragement, and she hadn't thought anything of it. She thought of it now differently. She thought he might have known by that Sunday that he didn't have long, and she thought that what he'd said hadn't been encouragement. It had been instruction. She blinked once. "Hard, who else knows about this document?" she asked. "2 people, Nico said. "Myself and the person who helped your father draft and secure it. Still alive. He's been watching this situation from a distance for some time." "Why now?" she said. "Why tell me now today after the divorce?" "Because Lorenzo's timeline has accelerated. The Carbone and Ricci auditors arrive in 11 days. Once they complete their review, Lorenzo intends to present his case against you to both families simultaneously. If he does that before the truth surfaces," Nico stopped. Chose his next words. "The families don't use courts, Isabella. They use their own processes." She understood what he was not saying. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. Steady in a way she hadn't expected, sitting in an unfamiliar kitchen, being told that her ex-husband had built a case designed to end her life. "What do you need from me?" she said. Nico looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd suspected. "Right now," he said nothing. "I need you to stay somewhere safe for the next 48 hours, while I locate the second copy of your father's agreement and verify its authentication. After that," he paused, "after that you'll have a choice to make. And I'll need you to be ready to make it." She nodded. He stood. "There's a room upstairs. Clean clothes, your size an assumption. Forgive me, we can adjust. You don't have to trust me completely. You just have to stay." He moved to leave the kitchen. She said his name. He stopped. "The agreement my father made," she said. "If it's authenticated. If everything in those files is what you say it is." She held his gaze. "Is there a way to expose it that doesn't get anyone killed?" Nico was quiet for 4 full seconds. "Possibly," he said. "It depends on how willing you are to step into rooms you've spent 11 years being kept out of." He left her with the folders. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the gallery she'd closed, the friends she'd stopped calling, the person she'd been at 30, before she'd learned to make herself smaller, to fit inside someone else's life. She thought about her father's handwriting at the bottom of a document he'd died before she'd ever read. She thought about Lorenzo's smile across the conference table that morning. "We both know you don't have a choice." She opened the third folder. The first page was a detailed organizational chart of Lorenzo's financial network, holding companies, front businesses, offshore structures, the full anatomy of an empire built on hidden movements and strategic misdirection. She'd seen the surface of this world for 11 years. She'd never been shown the skeleton. She started reading. She read for 2 hours. By the time she heard footsteps on the floor above her and the quiet sounds of the house settling into evening, she had a much clearer picture of the machine that Lorenzo had spent 20 years building, and of the specific, deliberate way it had been constructed to function, without her ever knowing it existed. She also had a much clearer picture of how it could be taken apart. She hadn't decided anything yet, but something in her chest, something that had been low and dormant for a very long time, had quietly changed its frequency. Not anger, not fear, something older and more patient than either of those. She turned the next page. The house was quiet around her. Outside, the city did what cities do, indifferent, loud, continuing without reference to any individual story happening inside it. Isabella Moretti kept reading. She was 41 years old, and she had nothing left to lose, and she was only just beginning to understand that this, precisely this, was the most dangerous thing Lorenzo had ever done to her. Not the erasure, not the frame-up. The thing he'd done by taking everything. He'd made her free, and somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that still remembered what she'd been before she became his wife, something she'd thought was gone a long time ago was very quietly waking up. She was still reading at midnight when the knock came. 3 taps deliberate, on the kitchen door frame. Not the door itself, the frame. Like someone who knew the difference between announcing themselves and startling a person who'd spent the day absorbing information that could get her killed. Nico stood in the entrance with 2 mugs. He set one near her elbow without asking, and pulled the chair across from her, out from the table, and sat down with the careful movement of a man whose knees had opinions about cold floors. She looked up from the organizational chart. Who built this? She tapped the page. The shell structure, the Cayman routing through the Luxembourg, holding this isn't Lorenzo's thinking. He's operational, not architectural. Who designed this for him? Nico wrapped both hands around his mug. A man named Dario Fenn. Financial engineer. He worked for 3 different organizations, over 15 years, before Lorenzo retained him exclusively in 2014. Is he still alive? Last confirmed location was Lisbon. 8 months ago. Nico paused. He disappeared shortly after the Carbone family started asking questions about the fund discrepancies. She looked at the page again. The disappearance of the man who'd built the machine. The accelerating audit timeline. The frame constructed around her name. None of it was improvised. This had been planned in stages, each stage triggered by a different pressure point in Lorenzo's world. He's been preparing this for a while, she said. At minimum 2 years, Nico said. Possibly longer. She turned the page. Then he was planning the divorce before I knew the marriage was over. Yes. She said nothing for a moment. The coffee was hot and bitter and real in her hands. That's the part that bothers me most, she said finally. Not the money, not the frame. The fact that while I was still trying to figure out how to save it, he was already building the exit. With me as the body he'd leave behind. Nico didn't offer a consolation. She appreciated that more than she could say. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow starts early. She didn't sleep much. 4 hours, maybe. The room upstairs was clean, like he'd said, white walls, window that looked onto a brick courtyard, a radiator that clicked and breathed through the night. She lay on top of the blanket for an hour before she got under it. She stared at the ceiling and took inventory. What she had, a settlement she couldn't live on, a name that was about to become a liability, and a father's document she'd never known existed. What she didn't have, any clear idea of what to do in the next 11 days. She thought about the gallery again. Not with grief this time, she was past that particular kind of grief. She thought about it with something more useful. She'd built that gallery from almost nothing. 2 connections, a borrowed concept, and the ability to stand in a room and understand what people needed before they understood it themselves. She'd done it once. The radiator ticked. She closed her eyes. She was thinking about the Luxembourg routing when she finally went under. Morning came gray and cold. She heard movement downstairs before 6 footsteps, the low cadence of a phone conversation in Italian, the smell of something being cooked. When she came down, there was a man she hadn't seen the previous night sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop open and an expression that suggested he'd been awake considerably longer than she had. Mid-40s, angular face, eyes that moved to her, and then back to the screen in one economic motion. Marco, Nico said from the stove without turning. He handles the operational side. Marco gave her a nod that contained exactly as much information as it needed to and no more. She sat down. What happened overnight? 2 things, Nico said. He plated something, eggs, toast, functional food, no ceremony, and set it in front of her. Then he sat. First, Lorenzo's people made contact with Crane's office late last night. A phone call to Daniel's personal cell, not the firm line. They weren't threatening, they were warning. The message was that any further legal action regarding the asset transfers would be characterized as harassment, and that the firm's other clients might find the association inconvenient. She set down her fork. They went after Daniel. They signaled. There's a difference for now. Nico met her eyes. Daniel is a good attorney. He's also a practical one. He has a firm to protect. He'll back off. He already has. He sent a message this morning withdrawing from any further action related to the asset disputes. Nico's voice carried no judgment. He's not a coward. He's a man with employees and overhead and a family. Lorenzo knows exactly who to pressure. She picked up her fork again, made herself eat 2 bites. And the second thing? Nico looked at Marco, who turned the laptop to face her. On the screen was a photograph. A woman early 30s, dark hair, sharp cheekbones, wearing a coat Isabella recognized because she'd seen it 17 times on someone she'd tried to stop noticing. Standing outside, what appeared to be a parking structure, looking over her shoulder, holding a small dark rectangle in one hand. Bianca Romano, Marco said. Taken at 11:43 last night, outside the parking structure adjacent to Lorenzo's primary office building in Midtown. Isabella looked at the object in Bianca's hand. Is that a drive? It's consistent with a portable hard drive. Small. The kind you'd use for encrypted file storage. Marco zoomed the image. Grainy at the edges, but clear enough. She exited the building through the service entrance. Bypassed the main lobby cameras, which means she knew where they were. She knew the building. She also didn't use her own vehicle. She walked 3 blocks and got into a car registered to a shell company with no visible connection to Lorenzo. Isabella looked at the photograph for a long time. She's running. She's scared, Nico said. There's a difference. Isabella thought about Bianca Romano. She'd spent considerable energy over the past 2 years trying not to think about Bianca Romano. The woman who'd attended dinners in Isabella's home, sat at her table, accepted a glass of wine from a host who'd had no idea who she was until the evidence became impossible to ignore. She'd built a complete picture of Bianca in her imagination, younger, easier, uncomplicated. Everything Isabella had apparently stopped, being the moment she became familiar. She'd made Bianca into a symbol and hated the symbol comprehensively. Looking at that photograph, she found the symbol harder to maintain. The woman in the grainy image didn't look like anyone's prize. She looked like someone who'd just realized the ground under her feet wasn't solid. Does Lorenzo know she took it? Isabella asked. Not yet, Marco said. Probably within the next 12 to 18 hours. He runs inventory on his private office on a weekly basis, but this week's review is scheduled for tomorrow morning. When he finds it missing, he let the sentence finish itself. He'll know immediately it was her, Isabella said. She's the only person with physical access to that office, outside of his 2 senior men. And his senior men didn't take it, which means she did, and he'll know. And then Nico picked up his coffee. Didn't finish the thought. Isabella finished it for him. And then she becomes a liability instead of a girlfriend. Nico looked at her steadily. You understand how this works. I've been adjacent to it for 11 years, she said. I understand more than he ever knew I did. She pushed the plate aside. How do we find her? Marco and Nico exchanged a look. Not hesitant, more like confirmatory. Like she'd said the expected thing and now they could move. She'll reach out, Nico said. If she's smart, and she is, she knows she can't sell that drive to anyone without being exposed. She can't sit on it without being found. The only place she has is to find someone who can protect her in exchange for what she's carrying. And she'll figure out that someone is me, Isabella said. It's possible she's already figured it out, Marco said. She knows who you are. She knows you have every reason to want what's on that drive. He closed the laptop. What she doesn't know is whether you'd help her or hand her back. Kitchen was quiet for a moment. Isabella thought about that. About what kind of person she was deciding to be in this particular moment. About how easy it would be to let Bianca Romano become collateral. She'd certainly made enough of Isabella's life difficult, however unwittingly, to deserve some indifference. About how her father would have looked at her if she'd made that calculation out loud. When she reaches out, Isabella said, "Bring her in." Marco nodded, made a note on his phone. "There's one more thing," Nico said. He reached into the folder he'd brought down with him. She hadn't noticed it until now, and removed a photograph. Printed, not digital. He set it on the table between them. A pocket watch. Old. Brass or gold, she couldn't tell from the image. Engraved on the back in cursive, small, precise letters she couldn't read at this scale. Your father's, Nico said. He left it with Samuel Rook, his attorney in the final year of his life. Rook practiced out of a small firm in New Haven. He wasn't connected to any of Lorenzo's world, which was the point. Your father used him specifically for the things he wanted to keep separate. He tapped the photograph. Inside the watch is a secondary compartment, not immediately visible. Inside the compartment is a micro-storage device, files. Your father's own documentation of everything he'd found on Lorenzo transaction records, correspondence, dates, and amounts. His personal evidence, assembled before the wedding and updated twice in the 2 years before he died. Isabella stared at the photograph. He built a case, she said quietly. He built a case, Nico confirmed. He never had the chance to use it. But he made sure it would survive him. She pressed the tips of her fingers against the edge of the table. Hard, grounding again. Is Rook still alive? Yes. 71, semi-retired, still practices limited estate work out of a New Haven office. He's been waiting. Nico paused. He knew someone would come eventually. He didn't know when. He made me a promise before your father died that he'd hold it until someone with the right name asked for it. He doesn't know I'm here, Isabella said. No, I wanted to tell you about it before I made contact. It's yours to decide whether to retrieve it, and when, and how. She looked at the photograph a moment longer. Then she placed it face down on the folder. Contact him, she said. Don't tell him everything. Tell him enough. Nico picked up his phone. The day moved in pieces. Marco worked the laptop with the quiet intensity of someone who communicated better with machines than people. He was tracking Lorenzo's financial movements, not accessing them. Nothing that would create a visible intrusion, but monitoring the edges, the public surfaces of transactions that rippled out from the private core. By noon, he'd confirmed 2 things. The Carbone family's auditors had arrived in the city a day ahead of schedule, and Lorenzo had moved a significant sum, 7 figures from one of his accessible accounts into a structure Marco couldn't immediately identify. He's repositioning, Marco said. Moving things to places his own auditors won't easily find before the Carbone people get there. Which means he's scared, Nico said. Which means he's about to move faster, Isabella said. Both men looked at her. A scared man who has a plan speeds the plan up. He's not going to wait for the auditors to finish their review and then blame me. He's going to give them the evidence against me before they finish. Control the narrative before anyone else can. Nico was quiet for a moment. How long do we have? Marco looked at his screen. If he follows the repositioning, which has a presentation to the families, 48 hours. Maybe less. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look older and more tired than it was. Isabella stood at the counter and thought about 11 days becoming 48 hours, and about how quickly the ground could shift when someone with resources decided to shift it. Her phone buzzed. Not the phone she'd walked out of the courthouse with. Nico had asked her to leave that one upstairs. Turned off. This was a secondary device Marco had handed her that morning. A clean number. A text from an unregistered contact. 4 words, I need to talk. She showed it to Marco. He cross-referenced the number in a way she didn't ask about. Bianca, he said. Isabella looked at the message. Thought about Bianca standing in that parking structure at midnight, holding a drive she'd stolen from a man who would kill her for it, walking to a car registered to a shell company because she didn't trust anything connected to her own name. She typed back, "Where are you?" The response took 4 minutes. An address in Greenpoint, an apartment building, 3rd floor. She typed, "Stay there, I'm coming." Nico was already standing. "I'll drive." "No," Isabella said. "I go alone. She reached out to me if she sees a car full of people she doesn't know, she'll run." She held up a hand before he could argue. "I'll take the phone. Marco can track it. But I go to the door alone." Nico looked at Marco. Marco shrugged, which apparently counted as tactical agreement. 2 hours, Nico said. "If you're not back in contact in 2 hours." "I will be," she said. The Greenpoint address was a narrow building wedged between a laundromat and a place that sold specialty coffee and looked closed. 3rd floor meant 4 flights. The elevator was taped over with an out-of-order sign that had been there long enough to start peeling. She took the stairs. The stairwell smelled like takeout containers and old carpet and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from a building where people are working too hard to maintain things. She knocked on 3C. Silence. Then the sound of someone checking the peephole. The door opened on a chain. One eye looked at her through the gap. Dark, with the red-rimmed quality of someone who'd been awake too long and crying not quite long enough. "It's really you," Bianca said. "It's really me," Isabella said. "Alone." The chain came off. The door opened. The apartment was small, clean in the functional way of a temporary space, someone else's furniture, the minimum of personal items. A bag on the bed, half packed or half unpacked, impossible to tell which. A laptop open on the table. The curtains were drawn. Bianca Romano in person was different from the image Isabella had constructed of her. Younger, yes, she was 31. Isabella knew that from the documents she'd gone through. But not softer. There was nothing soft about the woman standing in the middle of this borrowed apartment, in clothes she'd clearly been wearing for 20 hours, arms crossed over her chest, jaw tight. Looking at Isabella with an expression that was equal parts defiance and something close to terror. "I didn't want to call you," Bianca said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," Isabella said. "I don't want your." Bianca stopped. Started again. "I'm not asking for anything except to not be killed." "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like a reasonable request," Isabella said. "Sit down." Bianca sat. Isabella didn't. She stayed standing, not for dominance, but because she needed to be able to read the room from a full vantage. "When did you know?" Isabella said. Bianca pressed her palms flat on her thighs. "That he was going to... that it was ending, that you'd gone from future wife to liability." "When did you feel it shift?" Bianca looked up at her. Something moved across her face, an accounting of how honest to be. Then she exhaled. 3 weeks ago. He stopped taking my calls same day. Little thing, right? But it had never happened before. He was always. She stopped again, pulled her composure together with visible effort. He was attentive, in a way that felt like caring, but was really just control. When the attention started pulling back, I knew something had changed. She looked at her hands. I started paying attention to other things. His meetings. Schedule. Who he was talking to. I know his office well enough to know when things had been moved. 2 weeks ago, I found a folder, physical paper, in a drawer he kept locked. I have a key because she pressed her mouth tight. Because he trusted me with things he thought gave me a reason to be loyal. What was in the folder? Your name, Bianca said. Printed documents. Financial records with your signature on them, except they weren't right. I've seen his real documents. I've seen real authorization signatures from his organization for years. These were close, but they had a production quality, like they'd been generated to look real, not actually processed through the proper channels. She looked up. Someone had built them, carefully. But I've seen enough of the real thing to see the seam. Isabella felt something cold and certain settle into her chest. He didn't know you could tell the difference. No, a humorless sound, not quite a laugh. He thought I was decoration. The two women looked at each other across the room. Isabella thought about everything she'd spent the last 2 years feeling about Bianca Romano. The anger, the specific intimate humiliation of being replaced. The way she'd built this person into a symbol of everything wrong, the easier woman, the simpler choice. Looking at her now, in this borrowed apartment with her arms around herself and her eyes raw, Isabella felt the architecture of that anger shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way people meant it. But something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. Two people who'd made the mistake of underestimating the same man in different ways. The drive, Isabella said. Bianca went to the bag on the bed. From inside a jacket pocket, an interior one. Pressed against the lining, she removed a small black rectangle and held it out. Isabella took it. I don't know the encryption key, Bianca said quickly. I tried to access it. I couldn't. I might not need to, Isabella said. She turned it over in her hand. Do you know what's on it? Financial records. That much I know, he called it his insurance archive. He used to joke that he kept everything that could ever hurt him in a place nobody would ever find it, so it could never be used against him. She paused. He was less funny about it 3 weeks ago. Isabella put the drive in her coat pocket. You need to come with me. Bianca straightened. Come with you where? Somewhere you can't be found for the next few days. Isabella watched her face. I'm not offering this because I owe you anything. I'm offering it because we both have reasons to want the same outcome, and you have something I need. The whole arrangement. Clean. Bianca held her gaze for a long moment. Then she stood up and zipped the bag. It took her 40 seconds to pack the rest of what she needed. Isabella noticed that. A woman who could be ready to leave in 40 seconds was a woman who'd been ready to leave for a while. They took the stairs down. On the street, Isabella texted the clean phone one word coming and hailed a cab rather than waiting for Nico, because Bianca didn't know Nico yet and she'd already decided once today that she needed control over the pacing. They rode in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then Bianca said, I mocked you. Isabella looked out the window. I know. At one of his dinners. I said something, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I said something about his ex-wife being, she stopped. Cruel. I was performing for him. I thought it was what he wanted. It was, Isabella said. He did. That doesn't make it. No, Isabella's agreed. It doesn't. Another silence. I'm sorry, Bianca said. Flat. Not melodramatic. Just the word, set down. Isabella didn't respond to it. She wasn't ready to respond to it, and she wasn't going to perform a forgiveness she didn't have yet. But she also didn't dismiss it. They sat with the silence the rest of the way. Back at the brownstone, Nico opened the door before they reached it. He looked at Bianca with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that meant he had an opinion he was keeping to himself. He looked at Isabella with something closer to relief. Inside, he said. Marco appeared from the kitchen doorway, laptop under one arm, and assessed Bianca with the same quick economy he assessed everything. He didn't introduce himself. In the kitchen, Isabella placed the drive on the table. She took it from Lorenzo's private office. He runs inventory tomorrow morning. Marco picked it up, looked at it. Encryption? She doesn't have the key, Isabella said. I don't need the key, he said, and took it to the table. He connected it to a device that wasn't a standard laptop, something with more ports and a different operational display. He started working. Nobody spoke to him. Nico made more coffee. Nobody refused it. Bianca sat at the far end of the table and wrapped both hands around a mug and stared at a point in the middle of the table. Not absent, present, precise. The look of someone mentally running through their situation from every angle. 40 minutes later, Marco said, I'm in. He turned the screen to face the table. File after file. Clearly organized Lorenzo's work, or whoever had managed this archive for him. Transaction records going back 12 years. Offshore account structures. Agreement documents with signatures from people. Isabella recognized Mafia family names, investment entities, legitimate businesses that fronted for less legitimate operations. And then, in a subfolder, marked with a date from 7 years ago, something else. Marco opened it. Isabella leaned forward, a correspondence chain. Emails internal between Lorenzo and a man identified only as D. F, the initials of Dario Fenn, the financial engineer Nico had mentioned. The chain spanned 14 months. And in it, laid out across 37 messages, was the complete construction of a fraudulent digital identity, how Isabella's credentials had been obtained without her knowledge, how a shadow profile had been built under her name, how the fake account in the Cayman structure had been seeded with her forged signature, and how every step had been timed to a calendar that corresponded exactly to Lorenzo's relationship deterioration and the accelerating pressure from his own organization. The frame had been in construction for 14 months. She'd been his exit strategy before she'd known she was anything to exit from. "Print it," she said. Her voice was steady. She was distantly surprised by that. "There's more," Marco said. He scrolled. Deeper in the subfolder, a set of scanned documents. Old paper, the grain of a physical page run through a scanner at high resolution. Legal language. Her father's letterhead. And at the bottom, a handwritten notation from Lorenzo. Recent, the handwriting was distinctive. She'd seen it on 100 things over the years. The notation read, "Destroy original. Keep copy for leverage only." He'd found her father's agreement. He hadn't destroyed the original, he'd kept a copy, and ordered someone else to destroy the evidence. Which meant the original still existed somewhere. Which meant Samuel Rook had the real one. Which meant the pocket watch was the center of everything. Isabella sat back, Marco was quiet, Nico was quiet. Bianca was looking at the screen with an expression that was past shock. She'd already done her shock in the last 3 weeks. What she was doing now was calculating. "He was going to burn all of us," Bianca said softly. "Not to anyone in particular. Me too, I was in the plan too." "Not as the scapegoat," Nico said carefully. "No," she said. "As the loose end." The word hung in the kitchen air. Isabella looked at the screen, looked at the date on Lorenzo's notation. Looked at the correspondence chain between Lorenzo and the man who'd built her erasure from scratch. 11 days had become 48 hours, and 48 hours, she now understood, was optimistic. If Lorenzo's inventory check tomorrow morning discovered the drive was missing, the timeline collapsed entirely. He'd know someone had accessed his private office. He'd know Bianca had taken it. He'd understand that Bianca had gone somewhere, and he was a man who understood very quickly what his vulnerabilities were and moved to seal them with extreme efficiency. The next move had to happen tonight. "Rook," she said. "We need to get to Samuel Rook tonight, before Lorenzo runs his inventory, before he knows the drive is gone." She looked at Nico. "Can you get us to New Haven by midnight?" Nico checked his watch. It was 4:50 in the afternoon. "Yes," he said. "Then we need to leave in 2 hours." She pushed back her chair. "Marco, copy everything from that drive and get the copies off-site to somewhere Lorenzo's people can never reach. The original stays with us." Marco was already moving. "Bianca." Isabella looked at her. The woman who'd been Lorenzo's chosen replacement, who'd stolen his most protected files, who'd shown up at a strange door and said, "I don't want to be killed with the flat." Honest exhaustion of someone who'd finally run out of better options. "Are you in or are you out?" Bianca set down her mug. "I'm the only person in this room Lorenzo trusted enough to give office access to. I know his schedule, his secondary contacts, his routines, and the names of the 3 men closest to him." She held Isabella's gaze. "I'm in, all the way." Isabella nodded. She stood up from the table. Outside, the November evening was closing in fast, the last of the light going gray and thin over the rooftops. Somewhere, on the other side of the city, Lorenzo Moretti was moving money and repositioning assets and building his final case against the woman he'd spent 11 years using as furniture. He was a man who'd won every room he'd ever walked into by making sure he controlled everything inside it. He didn't know about the drive. He didn't know about the brownstone. He didn't know that the 2 women he'd most underestimated were sitting at the same table. And he didn't know not yet that the pocket watch's dead rival had left with an old attorney in New Haven, contained the document that could dismantle everything he'd spent 20 years building. Isabella put her coat on. She checked the clean phone. She checked the drive was still in her pocket. She thought about her father's handwriting at the bottom of an agreement nobody was supposed to find, and about the specific kind of man who protects his daughter by building something quiet and durable and designed to survive him. "You're stronger than you know, Bella." She buttoned the coat. The car was in the back of the brownstone. Nico had the keys. They had 2 hours before they needed to leave, and about 6 hours before Lorenzo's world started looking for the thing that was already gone. She walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to the room where she'd slept badly and read her father's enemy's financial architecture until she understood it well enough to find it. She was back downstairs in 11 minutes, coat on, bag over one shoulder, the drive still in her left pocket. She'd checked it twice on the stairs without meaning to, the automatic gesture of someone carrying something they can't afford to lose. The kitchen was in full motion. Marco had 2 devices running simultaneously and was transferring files in encrypted batches to off-site storage locations he didn't name out loud. Bianca was at the far end of the table with a notepad, writing down names and contact information from memory Lorenzo's secondary network, the people he used when he didn't want his primary associates to know he was moving. Her handwriting was quick and tight and didn't pause, which meant she'd been organizing this information in her head for days before she'd had anywhere to put it. Nico was on the phone in the hallway, speaking in a low-level Italian that carried no inflection Isabella could read from this distance. He caught her eye as she came down, held up one finger 1 minute, and kept talking. She went to Marco. "How much is copied? 60%. The financial records are done. I'm working through the correspondence files now." He didn't look up from the screens. "The Fen Lorenzo chain is already off-site. 3 separate locations, 2 of which don't exist, on any network Lorenzo's people would know to look for." Good. She looked at the original drive still connected to his device. "When you're done, I want that wiped." Marco glanced up briefly. "The original? Lorenzo can't know what we have until we choose to show him. If he finds the drive missing and then finds it, I want him to find nothing." Marco looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to work. Nico came in from the hallway, pocketing his phone. "Rook is expecting us. I didn't give him details, I told him. We were coming in connection with something he's been holding." He understood. "He's been waiting," Isabella said. "He has." Nico pulled his coat from the back of the chair. "He didn't ask questions, which means he's been expecting this call long enough that it didn't surprise him." She thought about Samuel Rook, a man who'd kept a pocket watch for 6 years with encrypted evidence inside it, maintaining a promise to a dead man, waiting for someone who might never come. That kind of patience was either devotion or guilt, and she wasn't sure yet which one was driving it. She'd find out in 3 hours. They left at 6:45. Marco stayed at the brownstone to finish the transfers and monitor Lorenzo's digital perimeter, the edges of the network, where movement would show if Lorenzo's people started looking. Bianca came with them, at Isabella's insistence, in the back of Nico's car with the kind of silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable so much as careful. 2 people who'd agreed to a truce without formally declaring one. The drive to New Haven was an hour and 40 minutes on a clear night. It was not a clear night. Rain started somewhere on the I-95 corridor and built itself into the kind of November downpour that made the road ahead a series of blurred red lights and gray suggestion. Nico drove steady, unhurried, with the practiced stillness of a man who'd made tense drives in bad weather before, and understood that anxiety transmitted itself through the accelerator. Isabella watched the rain and thought about her father. His office had smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular brand of ink he'd used in his fountain pen since before she could remember. He'd had a desk that was too large for the room, and he'd refused to replace it because it had belonged to his own father, and sentiment outweighed inconvenience in his personal accounting. She'd done homework at the corner of that desk for years. She'd learned to read at that desk. She'd had her first cup of real coffee at that desk, at 14, while he explained to her with characteristic directness that the world rewarded people who paid attention and penalized people who preferred not to know things. Pay attention, Bella, to everything, especially the things people don't mean for you to notice. She'd thought for most of her adult life that he'd been talking about business, about negotiation, about the particular intelligence of reading a room. She understood now he'd been talking about Lorenzo. He'd known. He'd known what Lorenzo was before she'd married him, and he'd known he couldn't stop it without putting her at greater risk. And so he'd done the only thing available to a careful man who understood that some dangers couldn't be eliminated, only documented. He'd built her a weapon, hidden it somewhere safe, and died before he could tell her it existed. She pressed her fingers against the door panel. Hard, then she let go. "You all right?" Bianca said, not looking at her. Eyes forward. "Yes," Isabella said, also not looking. "You?" "No," Bianca said, flat and honest. "But I don't think that's relevant right now." Isabella almost said something to that. Instead, she watched the rain. Samuel Rook's office was on the third floor of a narrow building on Chapel Street, above a framing shop that was dark and closed for the night. The building's exterior was older than its neighbors, and hadn't been renovated in the way that meant maintained, not updated, the kind of place that trusted its bones and didn't bother with the surface. A single light was on in the third-floor window, visible through the rain. Nico found parking a block away. They walked through the downpour fast, heads down, Nico holding an umbrella over Isabella in a gesture that was automatic and not commented on. The building's front door buzzed open before they reached it, which meant Rook had been watching from above. Third floor. The stairwell was warm and smelled like old wood, and something Rook had clearly been cooking, because beneath the office smell there was the faint domestic ghost of onions and something herbed. The door at the top was already open. Samuel Rook was 71 and looked like a man who'd spent 40 years listening to things he couldn't repeat. Medium height, the slight forward lean of someone who'd sat at desks most of his life, white hair worn short, eyes that were still sharp in the way of people who've learned to compensate for what the rest of the body is doing. He wore a cardigan over a collared shirt, and he held himself with a stillness that came from professional habit, the stillness of someone who'd learned to make other people feel like they were in the most stable room available. He looked at Isabella. Something crossed his face. Complicated. Grief adjacent. "You look like him," he said. Around the eyes. "I know," she said. He stepped back to let them in. The office was the kind of space that accumulated over decades rather than being designed. Books on every surface, files in organized density, a desk that was actually clear, she noted that, one clear surface in the organized accumulation, which meant Rook was the kind of person who kept his working space deliberate, even when everything around it grew organic. 2 chairs across the desk, a third brought in from somewhere else, still at a slight angle. He'd been expecting 3 people. She filed that away. He closed the door, didn't offer refreshments. Some instinct for the room's temperature, probably they hadn't come for hospitality, and performing it would have felt wrong. He went behind the desk and they sat, and he looked at each of them in turn with the assessor's eye of a man who'd dealt with people in crisis for 4 decades. "Nico told me enough," he said. "I don't need the full picture tonight. I've had the full picture for 6 years." He opened his desk drawer, the center one, the one you'd reach for without thinking, and removed the pocket watch. It was brass, she could see now, the surface worn smooth in the places a hand would naturally rest. Small, round, heavier looking than its size suggested. He placed it on the desk between them. "He gave it to me 14 months before he died," Rook said. He said, and I'm quoting as precisely as I can, after 6 years, he said, "If I'm gone and she hasn't come yet, she will eventually. The man she married doesn't sit still. He'll do something to make her move. When she comes, give her this. She'll know what to do with it." Isabella looked at the watch. "He said I'll know what to do with it," she repeated. He did. He was more confident than I am. Rook picked up the watch and held it toward her across the desk. He was confident, in the same way your father was confident about anything, not because he was certain of the outcome, but because he'd prepared for it. He did the work, so that when the moment came, the work would do what it needed to do without him. The watch. It was warmer than she expected. The weight of it was substantial and specific in a way that objects are when they've been handled for years. The warmth wasn't from Rook's hand. It was structural, accumulated. She turned it over. On the back, engraved in the precise cursive she'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the bottom of a legal agreement that had been buried for 6 years, for Bella. The truth outlasts the lie. Her throat closed. Just for a second. She swallowed through it. She pressed the crown, the small button on the edge, and the case opened. A standard watch face, hands stopped. She pressed the secondary catch at the 2 o'clock position, the one you'd only know about if you'd been told, and the inner case opened. A thin compartment. Inside, sealed in a small protective sleeve, a micro-storage device no larger than her thumbnail. "Do you know what's on it?" she asked Rook, in broad terms. He walked me through it before he gave it to me. Transaction records going back to before your marriage. Correspondence he'd gathered from sources inside Lorenzo's organization, people who trusted your father and had their own reasons to want a record kept. And one document in particular, he folded his hands on the desk. A full authenticated copy of the protection agreement with provenance documentation showing its creation date, the signatories, and the legal argument for its enforcement. Nico leaned forward. The copy Lorenzo found and ordered destroyed. "Lorenzo found a copy," Rook said carefully. "He didn't find this one. Your father made 3 copies, separated them, and put them in 3 different places with 3 different people. He told only me about the watch. The other 2 copies went with people I was told nothing about, which means they can't be gotten to through me." He paused. "I don't know if the other 2 survived. This one did." "That's enough." Isabella closed the inner case, then the outer case. Held the watch in both hands. The rain was loud against the office window. She was aware of Bianca behind her left shoulder, quiet, not intruding. Aware of Nico to her right, running whatever calculation he was running. Aware of Rook across the desk, watching her with the careful neutrality of a man who'd been holding this moment in trust for 6 years and had the professional discipline to let it unfold at its own pace. She was also aware of the time, 8:53. They'd been in the building 11 minutes. She opened her mouth to speak. Her phone buzzed, the clean phone, one buzz text, not call. She looked at it. Marco. 2 words he knows. Her stomach dropped. She turned the phone so Nico could see it. She watched his expression process the information in, under a second, the quick blink, the jaw setting, the controlled exhale of a man who'd already factored this possibility into his contingency structure and was now activating it. "How?" she said, already typing back. Marco's response came in 3 parts, fast. "Inventory check moved to tonight, not tomorrow. Different schedule than we had. Drive confirmed missing 8:47 p.m. His people are moving. Bianca's apartment in Greenpoint already has eyes on it." She stood up. "We need to go," she said to Nico. Rook was already standing. "What's happened?" "Lorenzo knows something is missing. He'll know it was Bianca. He'll move fast." She looked at Rook. "Is there anything else here, anything connected to this, that can be traced back to you?" "Nothing with my name on it," he said, the precision of a lawyer. "The watch was in a personal deposit box registered to a trust that has no obvious connection to either your family or mine. Stay away from this office for the next 72 hours, she said. "Go somewhere you have a legitimate reason to be. Don't contact me. I'll contact you." He nodded. No protest, no argument. The response of a man who'd been sitting in the patient middle of something dangerous for 6 years and understood that the active phase required different behaviors. They moved. Down the stairs, out the door, into the rain. Nico had the car running before Bianca had her door fully closed. He pulled into traffic and drove without urgency. Too fast would be noticed, and they needed to be noticed more than they needed to be fast. "Where are we going?" Bianca said. Her voice was controlled, but her hands were pressed flat on her knees again. The posture Isabella was coming to recognize as Bianca's version of keeping herself together. "Not the brownstone," Nico said. "If he's already moving, we assume any location I've used before is potentially compromised." He glanced in the rear view. "I have a secondary location in Hoboken. Nobody from Lorenzo's world knows it exists." Isabella was texting Marco. "Get out. Take everything. Go to the Hoboken address." Marco, already in the car. "Left 4 minutes ago." She exhaled. She put the phone down and looked out at the rain-slicked highway and held the pocket watch in her closed fist and thought about 48 hours becoming tonight and about how Lorenzo's inventory schedule, moving by 12 hours, had restructured everything. They were 40 minutes from Hoboken when Bianca said quietly, "He's going to think I went to you." "Yes," Isabella said, "which means he's going to think you have the drive." "Also yes, which means he's going to move against you directly now. Not through the families directly." Bianca's voice was still controlled, but something underneath it was starting to show at the edges. "You don't know what that looks like. I do. I've seen what he does when someone takes something from him. He doesn't send a message first. She stopped. He moves." "I know," Isabella said. "You don't." "I've been married to him for 11 years, Isabella said, with a quiet that was not a comfort. I know exactly what he looks like when he decides someone is a problem to solve. She turned to look at Bianca directly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. That's why we can't wait for the gala, or the audit, or the right moment. We need to move in the next 24 hours with what we have, or we lose the window entirely. Bianca looked at her. Something shifted in her expression, the last of the calculation, the last weighing of remaining options. Then it settled. "What do you need me to do?" she said. The Hoboken location was a floor-through apartment above a dry goods importer Nico's, in the sense that it was held through a structure nobody from Lorenzo's world would know to associate with him. Functional, clean, the bare minimum. Marco was already there when they arrived, both laptops open on the kitchen table, his equipment spread and running. He looked up when Isabella came through the door. "I pulled everything before I left." "The brownstone is clean." "Good," she set the watch on the table. "What's Lorenzo's current movement?" "His car left his Midtown building at 9:17. Tracking suggests he's heading toward Brooklyn, toward addresses connected to his operational network, not his residential ones. He's consolidating." Marco pulled up a map on the secondary screen. "He's also made 4 phone calls in the last hour. I can't intercept them, but I can see the tower pings. 2 went to numbers connected to his security people. 1 went to a number I don't have a match for yet. 1 went to Marcus Webb," his attorney Isabella said. "He's going legal and operational simultaneously," Nico said, hanging his wet coat by the door. "Legal to start building the presentation for the families. Operational to find us," Bianca said. She was standing with her arms crossed, dripping slightly from the rain, and she looked like someone running a calculation she didn't like the answer to. "The number you don't have a match for. Can I see it?" Marco read it out. Bianca's face did something complicated. "That's Dante Gallo." Nico went very still. Marco looked up from the screen. Isabella looked at Bianca. "Who is Dante Gallo?" Bianca pressed her lips together. "He's the man Lorenzo uses when he wants something done without any documentation. He's not on payroll. There's no connection on paper. Lorenzo uses him for," she stopped, chose the word. "Removals." The word sat in the room. Isabella felt something cold move through her chest and settle. Not panic. Something more fundamental than panic. The particular clarity that comes when the nature of a threat becomes completely legible. Lorenzo hadn't made a business calculation tonight. He'd made a final one. "He's not building a case for the families anymore," she said. "He's skipping it." "The drive being taken changed his calculus," Nico said. His voice was careful and deliberate in the way of someone managing their own alarm. "He was going to frame you in front of the families. Now he knows someone has evidence against him. He can't risk the exposure time. He needs this resolved before anyone gets a chance to show those files to the Carbone or Ricci auditors. He's going to bury the evidence, and the people who have it," Isabella said. In that order, Marco was already typing. Fast focus, the click of keys filling the kitchen. "I can get the files to the Carbone family's financial people directly," he said without looking up. "Bypass Lorenzo entirely. Send everything we have from the drive, the Fen correspondence, the fake account documentation, the forged signatures, straight to their auditors, with enough context that they understand what they're looking at before Lorenzo can spin it." "How long?" Nico said. "To compile and encrypt the package, 2 hours. To make contact through a channel the Carbone people will trust, I need a name. Someone inside their financial operation who isn't also inside Lorenzo's pocket." Nico and Bianca both spoke at the same time. Nico said a name. Bianca said a different one. They looked at each other. "You know the Carbone organization's financial people," Nico said to Bianca. Not accusing, noting. Bianca held his gaze. "Lorenzo introduced me to everyone. He used me as social interface at meetings. He didn't want to look purely operational. I shook hands with the Carbone accountant at a dinner in March." She paused. "His name is Felix Carr. He's careful, he's not personally loyal to Lorenzo, and he has his own reasons to want clean books." "Can you reach him directly?" Marco said. "I have his personal number." She looked at Isabella. "From the dinner. Lorenzo gave it to me in case I needed to coordinate anything socially. He didn't know I kept it." "He didn't know you kept a lot of things," Isabella said. A bead of something crossed Bianca's face. Not pride. Something more painful, the accounting of all the ways she'd been underestimated by a man she'd trusted, and all the ways that underestimation was now the only thing keeping her alive. No, she said. He didn't. Isabella looked at the pocket watch on the table. The micro-storage device beside it, removed and ready for Marco to duplicate. At the laptop screen showing Lorenzo's car moving through Brooklyn, consolidating his operational resources, making calls to a man who resolved problems by eliminating them. She thought about what Nico had said at the brownstone the first night. What you do with it is your decision. She'd been thinking since then in terms of exposure, of revealing the evidence to the right people in the right room at the right moment. A public confrontation, a controlled reveal, the architecture of accountability. That architecture had just been demolished. Lorenzo wasn't going to give her a room. He wasn't going to give her time. He'd moved the inventory check up, found the drive missing, called Dante Gallo, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the Carbone auditors, the Ritchie family, or the legal structures of the evidence they'd assembled. He was coming, and the gap between coming and here was closing faster than any of them had planned for. Isabella picked up the pocket watch, turned it in her hand once. Set it back down. Bianca, she said, call Felix Carr. Tonight. Tell him you have documentation of financial fraud committed by Lorenzo Moretti against pooled family funds. Tell him the documentation is authenticated, comprehensive, and ready to be delivered. Tell him you need a meeting in the next 12 hours. Bianca nodded, already reaching for her phone. Marco, Isabella continued. Compile the package. Everything from the drive, plus the authenticated agreement from the watch. I need it ready to transmit in 2 hours. Marco was already working. Nico. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she'd started to recognize, the look of a man who'd expected something from her, and was now seeing whether his expectation had been accurate. Lorenzo used Dante Gallo for removals. You know that name. I saw your face when Bianca said it. You know what he's capable of. Yes, Nico said. Then I need to know what we're actually walking into. Not the version designed to keep me steady. The real version. Nico was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he sat down across from her and looked at her with the directness of someone who decided to stop calibrating. Dante Gallo has resolved 8 situations for Lorenzo in the last 7 years, he said. 2 of them were financial accountants who knew too much. 3 were organizational men inside Lorenzo's structure who were cooperating with outside investigators. 3 were personal. He paused. He doesn't leave traces. He doesn't negotiate. And he doesn't stop once Lorenzo gives the instruction unless Lorenzo personally reverses it. Isabella held his gaze. Has Lorenzo ever reversed an instruction once he gave it? Nico's expression gave her the answer before he said it. No, he said, he hasn't. The kitchen was very quiet, except for the sound of Marco typing and the rain still coming down outside, and Bianca in the corner speaking in a low, controlled voice to Felix Carr, reading out enough of what she knew to make him understand that what she had was real. Isabella stood up. She walked to the window, looked out at the Hoboken waterfront, through the rain the city across the river, its lights blurred and smeared by the water on the glass. Somewhere in that city, a man she'd spent 11 years living beside was directing the erasure of her existence with the same calm efficiency he'd applied to every other obstacle in his life. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd retired over the years. The gallery director. The woman who had opinions. The person who read things carefully and spoke when she thought she had something worth saying. The daughter of a man who'd taught her that the world rewarded people who paid attention. She'd spent 11 years learning to be invisible inside Lorenzo's life. She understood now that invisibility had a different use than she'd been putting it to. She turned back to the room. We're not waiting for the gala, she said. We're not waiting for the auditors. We're taking this directly to the Carbone and Ricci families, simultaneously not through their auditors, but through whatever channel Nico has to their leadership with everything we have. The drive files, the agreement, the provenance documentation. She looked at Nico. Tonight, Nico looked at her steadily. That's not a controlled reveal. That's an open move. Once we do that, Lorenzo knows exactly what happened. And who's responsible? He already knows, she said. He made that call to Dante Gallo an hour ago. We're not trying to protect our position anymore. We don't have one to protect. The only question is whether the evidence reaches the people who can act on it before Lorenzo reaches us. Nico held her gaze. Then he reached into his coat and removed his phone. He made the call. Bianca was still talking to Felix Carr, her voice low and precise, and Marco was compiling with the focused speed of someone who understood that the timeline had compressed down to something that didn't allow for errors. And outside, the rain came down on a city that knew nothing about any of this and didn't need to. Isabella stood in the middle of the room and felt the last of the careful, protected, invisible version of herself go quiet. What replaced it wasn't anger, and it wasn't courage in the way people meant when they used that word to make something sound simple. It was the particular clarity of a person who had run out of options that didn't require her to become someone Lorenzo Moretti had never once considered her capable of being. Picked up the pocket watch one more time. The truth outlasts the lie. She put it in her coat pocket. "Marco," she said, "how fast can you get that package ready if I help you?" Marco looked up, assessed her. "You know how to handle encrypted file compilation?" "I know how to learn anything I need to learn, in the time I have to learn it," she said. He slid the second laptop toward her. She sat down and got to work, and the night outside got darker and wetter, and the clock moved the way clocks move when everything depends on what happens before it reaches a number you're trying not to think about. And somewhere across the river, Lorenzo Moretti was about to discover that the woman he'd spent 11 years making invisible had been paying attention to. She learned fast. Marco didn't explain things twice. He said a thing once, in plain terms, and expected her to build on it, and she did, not because she had technical training, but because she had 11 years of watching how information moved through Lorenzo's world, which meant she understood structure, even when she didn't know the specific language for it. She knew how files were organized to obscure origin. She knew how documentation chains were built to look authoritative. She'd just never been on the side of building a counterchain before. They worked without talking, except for what was necessary. At 11:40, Marco sat back, packages complete. On the screen, everything. The Fen-Lorenzo correspondence, organized chronologically and annotated with clarifying context. The fraudulent account documentation, with Isabella's forged signature cross-referenced against authenticated examples of her actual signature from public legal records. The organizational chart of the shell structure, with each node labeled and each hidden connection surfaced. The micro-storage files from the pocket watch her father's records, 16 years of careful documentation, the authenticated agreement with full provenance. All of it compiled, encrypted, and ready. Across the room, Bianca had finished her call with Felix Carr 40 minutes ago, and had spent the time since sitting at the table, writing out a full account of her own knowledge dates, names, meetings she'd attended, things Lorenzo had said to her that she'd stored because some instinct had told her to keep records, even when she'd had no plan to use them. She was a witness. She understood that now. She'd been a witness to things she hadn't fully understood, and the understanding was arriving late and all at once, and she was handling it by writing it down with the determined precision of someone who'd decided that the only useful response to having been used was to make herself impossible to ignore. Nico had been on the phone twice more. He was quiet now, standing near the window, watching the rain. "Carbone family," he said without turning. "I have a confirmed contact at the leadership level, not the auditors, the family itself. They're willing to receive documentation and review it before proceeding with Lorenzo's presentation. They want everything sent by 2 a.m. Isabella looked at the clock. 11:53, we have time. Ricci is more complicated, he said. They've had a longer relationship with Lorenzo. My contact there is solid, but he's cautious. He won't commit to receiving anything without knowing what it is first. Then tell him what it is, Isabella said. Tell him we have authenticated evidence that Lorenzo Moretti has been diverting funds from pooled family investments into private accounts for 12 years. Tell him we have the original documentation that proves it, and the electronic records that show exactly how it was done. She paused. And tell him we have evidence that Lorenzo is currently in the process of framing a third party for those diversions, and has engaged someone to resolve the people who can expose it. If the Ricci family is on record as having been approached and declined to act, that's a conversation they'll eventually have with us, with the Carbone leadership. Nico was quiet. That's a pressure move, he said. Yes, she said. Make it. He made the call. Marco was already transmitting to the Carbone contact. The files moved in encrypted packages, sequenced, so the most verifiable materials arrived. First, the things that could be cross-referenced against existing records the Carbone organization would already have, which would establish credibility before the deeper documentation arrived. Isabella stood up. Her lower back ached from 2 hours, bent over the laptop, and she pressed her knuckles against it briefly, working at the tension with the automatic practicality of someone who didn't have time to acknowledge pain properly. Her eyes were dry and granular from screen work. She went to the kitchen, ran cold water over her hands, pressed her wet palms against her face. Looked at herself in the dark reflection of the kitchen window. She didn't look like the woman who'd left the courthouse that morning. She wasn't sure what she looked like, but it was something different, not harder exactly, more resolved. Like something internal had clarified, and the clarity was showing on the outside. She thought this is what he was afraid of, not the evidence. Not her father's agreement. This specific version of her, the one that had been underneath, the performed smallness all along, patient and observant and completely capable of burning down everything he'd built if he gave her sufficient reason. He'd given her sufficient reason. She went back to the main room. Marco said carbone package delivered, confirmation received. They're reviewing. Nico, still on the phone, held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes, Bianca was still writing. Isabella sat down. She put the pocket watch on the table in front of her and looked at it while she waited, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of preparation. At 12:19, everything changed. Marco's alert came first, a sound from his monitoring setup, a specific tone that meant something had crossed a threshold he'd configured. He looked at the screen, and his hand stopped moving. "What?" Isabella said. Lorenzo's car. Marco's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone relaying information in real time. "It stopped moving 20 minutes ago. I didn't flag it because cars stop. But the location," he turned the screen. "It's 3 blocks from the Carroll Gardens brownstone." The room absorbed that. "He found the brownstone," Nico said, off the phone now. "He found it empty," Marco said, "which is the only reason we're having this conversation. But he knows we were there, which means he's backtracking our movements, which means he has more information about our network than we thought he did," Isabella said. The words came out level. She noted that distantly, the levelness. Some part of her had been expecting this, some part that had learned from 11 years of watching Lorenzo operate that he was never as far behind as he seemed. "How?" Bianca said. She was standing now, the notepad down. "That's the question," Marco said. He was typing fast, pulling up routing logs, backtracking through the digital perimeter he'd been monitoring. If he found the brownstone, someone told him. Either the location was compromised through a contact or he stopped. Or what Isabella said. Marco looked up. His expression was careful in a way she didn't like. "The clean phones. I sourced them through a secondary supplier I've used before. If Lorenzo's people have been monitoring that supplier's distribution, he's been tracking the phones," Nico said. "Possibly. Not the calls, those are encrypted. But the physical location of the devices." Marco pressed his mouth flat. "Since we left the brownstone." The silence that followed was the specific kind that occurs when people are calculating simultaneously. "He knows we're in Hoboken," Isabella said. "He knows the phones are in Hoboken," Marco said. "Within a coverage radius. It's not precise, but it's enough to narrow it." Isabella looked at the clock. 12:22. She looked at Nico. "Carbone, have they had enough time to review?" "They're reviewing now. It takes time to verify this volume of..." "Then we need to buy more time." She stood. "We move now. Take the essentials, leave the phones here." "If we leave the phones..." "He follows the phones, not us." She looked around the room. "Marco, can you transmit anything remotely? From any secured device that isn't currently compromised?" She looked at Bianca. "Do you have a phone Lorenzo doesn't know about?" Bianca's expression said the answer before she spoke. "Yes, a personal one I bought 3 months ago when I started." She didn't finish the sentence. "He doesn't know about it. Give it to Marco." Isabella turned back to the room with the focused economy of someone running out of room to move carefully. "Leave the clean phones on the table. We take nothing that can be traced. Pocket watch, the copied files on Marco's secure drive, Bianca's written account, and ourselves." They moved. It took 6 minutes. Marco made 2 transfers, the remaining Richie package to Nico's personal encrypted channel, the backup file structure, to a remote server that existed in 3 countries and 0 single jurisdictions. He left both clean phones on the kitchen table, side by side, still active. They went out the back of the building, a service exit that opened onto a narrow alley between the dry goods importer and a vehicle storage facility. The rain had thinned, but it was still cold, and it hit the back of Isabella's neck when she came through the door and she didn't stop for it. Nico had a second vehicle, not the car they'd arrived in, but a different one, older, held under the same untraceable structure as the apartment. He got it from the storage facility 2 minutes later, pulling it around to the alley entrance. They got in. He drove. Nobody talked for the first 10 minutes. The city moved past, wet and orange-lit and indifferent. Isabella watched the side mirror, nothing behind them that stayed with them. Either the phone play was working, or Lorenzo hadn't moved on the location yet. Both of those things could stop being true very quickly. "Where are we going?" Marco said. Nico said a name. "An address in the West Village. A building, the gala venue," Bianca said. Not a question. "The Marchetti event," Nico confirmed. "Starts at 9 tomorrow evening. The Carbone family leadership will be there. It's a standing commitment for the winter gathering. They've attended every year for 14 years. The Ricci family sends representation. Half of Lorenzo's legitimate business associates will be in that room." He didn't look away from the road. "If we can't get the families to act on the documentation through private channels tonight, the gala is our contingency. Public confrontation in front of everyone simultaneously." "Lorenzo will be there," Bianca said. "Yes, if he knows we're going to be there." "He'll know," Nico said. "That's not avoidable. But Dante Gallo doesn't operate in rooms full of witnesses. Whatever Lorenzo has planned, the gala is the one place it can't happen the way he'd prefer." He paused. "Which means our window is everything before we walk through that door." Isabella looked at the city outside. The gala was 9 hours away. 9 hours in which Lorenzo was actively tracking them. The Carbone leadership was reviewing documentation that could end everything or change nothing, and Dante Gallo was somewhere in this city with an instruction that hadn't been reversed. She turned forward. "Tell me about the gala. The room, the layout, who has access to what?" Nico talked. She listened with the complete attention of someone memorizing terrain they'd have to navigate blind. They reached the West Village address at 1:15 in the morning. A building that Nico explained with minimal elaboration belonged to a business associate who owed him a significant favor and asked no questions. The 4th floor, clean, warm, with the anonymous comfort of a guest space that got used twice a year. Marco set up immediately. Bianca finished her written account and photographed each page with the clean phone. Emailing them to an address, Isabella gave her a personal account Lorenzo had never known about. Created at a library 2 years ago on an afternoon, Isabella had told herself she was just being careful. She'd been right to be careful. She hadn't let herself think too clearly about why. At 2:43, Marco said Carbone responded. Everyone in the room went still. He read from the screen. "They've completed an initial review. They're flagging the FEN correspondence and the account documentation for priority cross-reference against their own audit records. They want a meeting tomorrow." He looked up. "Before the gala." "Where?" Nico said. They suggested a location. Neutral ground, a private room at a restaurant they control financially. 4 o'clock. Isabella did the math. 4 o'clock. Gala at 9. 5 hours between the meeting and the confrontation, in which either the Carbone family would have enough to act on, or they wouldn't, and the gala would become something she didn't have a clean name for. "Confirm it," she said. Marco typed. She made herself lie down on the couch at 3:15. Not because she thought she'd sleep, but because her body was running on the last reserves of a day that had begun with signing divorce papers in a lawyer's office and had arrived here in a borrowed apartment at 1:15 in the morning with a pocket watch in her coat and a man named Dante Gallo somewhere in the city. She closed her eyes. She thought about her father's desk. The amber light. "You're stronger than you know, Bella." She slept for 2.5 hours. The morning came gray and sharp. Marco had stayed up. She could see it in the particular stillness of a person who'd crossed through tired and come out the other side. He'd continued monitoring. He briefed her at 6 while the coffee was heating. Lorenzo had spent the night in motion. His car had visited 4 separate locations across Brooklyn and Manhattan. One of those locations registered as the address of a building connected to Marcus Webb's firm, The Legal Move, Continuing. 2 were operational addresses. The 4th was an address Marco flagged with a carefully neutral expression. "What is that location?" she said. "It's a building in Red Hook," Marco said. "The unit has no registered occupant. It's connected through 3 layers to a holding structure that has no visible association with Lorenzo. But the IP registered to the building's access system appeared in the Fenn correspondence. He paused. Once, as a location where Dario Fenn accessed the shadow account system remotely. She looked at the address. Gallo is staging from there. That's my read, Marco said. Yes. She set her coffee down. 9 hours had become 3, and then morning, and now it was 6:47. And the Carbone meeting was at 4, and the gala was at 9, and Lorenzo was staging an asset from a building in Red Hook. And somewhere between all of those fixed points was the question of whether the evidence they'd assembled overnight would reach the people who could use it before the person Lorenzo had deployed reached them. At 8:30, Bianca appeared from the second room with her hair pulled back and the careful, held-together expression of someone who'd been through their fear in private and arrived at the functional side. She drank coffee, standing up and looked out the window and said, without preamble, Lorenzo is going to make a move before the gala. He's not going to wait for the room. I know, Isabella said. He's going to try to find us this morning. If he can't find us, he's going to try to discredit the evidence before it reaches the families, go to them directly, get ahead of whatever we've sent. She turned from the window. He knows the Carbone family was contacted last night. He'll know because he has a source inside their communication network. He's maintained one for years. Felix Carr told me. He said Lorenzo always knew what the Carbone auditors were seeing within 24 hours. Isabella went still. Felix Carr told you Lorenzo had a source inside the Carbone network? He told me Lorenzo was unusually well informed about Carbone's financial reviews. I didn't know what to do with that at the time. She held Isabella's gaze. If Lorenzo knows we sent documentation to the Carbone family last night, he's already building a counter-narrative. He's telling them the documentation is fabricated by a disgruntled ex-wife with a grudge and a Mafia financier with his own agenda. The room processed that. Then the meeting at 4 is a trap, Marco said quietly. Not a trap, Nico said. He'd come in from the hallway, coffee in hand, listening from the doorway. But a controlled environment. They'll meet with us. They'll listen. And then they'll tell Lorenzo everything we said. He looked at Isabella. Which means we can't go to the 4 o'clock meeting saying what we plan to say. We have to give them something they can verify independently before Lorenzo can counter it, Isabella said. Something that doesn't depend on taking our word against his, she thought. The account structure the shell, routing through the Luxembourg holding. If Marco can show the Carbone financial people the exact mechanism of how the diversions were made, with enough specificity that they can cross-reference against their own records in real time. I can build that, Marco said. A technical walkthrough. Specific account numbers, routing dates, amounts. Things their own auditors can verify against their internal records without any dependence on our characterization of the documents. How long? 2 hours. Start now. She turned to Nico. The Ricci contact. Has he responded this morning? They'll send representation to the gala. His voice was careful. Unofficial. They want to see what happens before they commit to anything. That's enough, she said. If the Ricci representation is there, and if the Carbone family has the technical walkthrough before 4 o'clock, and if we show them something, they can verify themselves. She stopped. Restructured. The gala has to be where it ends. Whatever happens at 4 o'clock, the gala is where we take it public. In front of everyone, all of it. Nico set down his coffee. You understand that if you stand up in that room and do what you're describing, there's no containing what happens after. The families will act. Lorenzo's organization collapses not quietly, not managed. It collapses in public, in front of every person who's built a relationship with him, and he knows it. That's when he becomes the most dangerous version of himself. He's already the most dangerous version of himself, Isabella said. He made that call to Dante Gallo last night. The only question is whether he gets to use that asset in a room with no witnesses, or whether we take that option away from him. She looked at Nico steadily. The gala is full of witnesses. That's the only protection we have. We have to get to that room. Nico held her gaze. She could see him running at every angle, every contingency, the specific calculation of a man who'd spent his career understanding how these situations moved and what they cost. It's all right, he said. The afternoon arrived the way afternoons do. After nights you haven't fully slept, abrupt, too bright, with the raw-edged quality of a world that hasn't been softened by adequate rest. At 3:15, they left for the Carbone meeting in 2 vehicles, Marco driving separately with the technical walkthrough, loaded on a device that had been clean-sourced through Bianca's personal phone. No connection to anything Lorenzo could have touched. The restaurant was on the Upper East Side. Private dining room accessed through a side entrance that bypassed the main floor. 5. 2 men at the door, large, still, professional. They patted Nico down with the efficient impersonality of people who did it constantly and didn't have opinions about it. They looked at Isabella with the particular assessment of men who'd been told to expect her and weren't sure what to do with what they found. She looked back. Inside a round table, 4 chairs, a man in his late 50s with a face that had the quality of expensive, patient stillness, and a younger man to his right with a laptop and the focused expression of someone whose job was to find the holes in whatever you were about to tell them. The older man introduced himself as Vincent, no last name. His handshake was brief and calibrated enough to register, not enough to mean anything yet. They sat. Marco opened the technical walkthrough. For 40 minutes, he walked the Carbone financial analyst through the exact mechanism. Count numbers, routing dates, the precise way that Dario Fenn had constructed the shadow structure, so that money moved out of the pooled fund allocations in amounts small enough to fall below standard audit thresholds, accumulated in a Luxembourg holding layer, and then transferred in larger consolidated movements to accounts that bore no connection to Lorenzo's visible network. The analyst cross-referenced against his own records on his own device 3 times. Each time he went quiet for a moment. Each time what he found matched what Marco was showing him. At 4:52, Vincent looked at Isabella. "How long have you had this?" "The electronic records since last night," she said. "The foundational documentation, my father, assembled it before I married Lorenzo. I didn't know it existed until 48 hours ago." Vincent was quiet. "What do you intend to do with it?" he said. "Tonight," she said, "at the Marchetti Gala, I'm going to stand in front of everyone who has a relationship with Lorenzo Moretti and show them exactly what I've shown you." She met his eyes without looking away. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen so you're not surprised. What you do with the information you've seen today is your decision." Vincent looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the analyst, who gave a small, specific nod. Vincent folded his hands on the table. "The Carbone family did not have this conversation," he said. "But we will be present tonight." They left the restaurant at 5:20. Outside, the November evening was closing in fast, the last light going copper and thin over the park a block away. Isabella stood on the sidewalk while Nico brought the car around and felt the cold moving through her coat and thought about 9 o'clock and what the room would look like and what Lorenzo's face would do when she walked through the door. She thought about Dante Gallo in a building in Red Hook. She thought about the 5 hours between now and 9 o'clock and what Lorenzo would do with them. Her phone, Bianca's clean phone, the one Lorenzo didn't know about, buzzed in her pocket. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds, then a voice, male moderate, carrying the specific absence of inflection that meant it was being controlled very deliberately. "Mrs. Moretti," the voice said, "my name isn't important. What's important is that I was given an instruction this morning that I'm going to tell you about. Because Lorenzo Moretti is someone I've worked for 7 years, and he just made a decision that I'm not willing to execute." Her breath moved in and out steady. "I'm listening," she said. "The instruction is to intercept you before you reach the Marchetti event tonight," the voice said. "The specific instruction is to ensure you don't enter the building." He specified that the result should be permanent, and that it should happen between 7 and 8:30, when his attendance at a pre-event dinner gives him an alibi. A pause. "He gave me your photograph and the description of 2 vehicles. One of them is the car that's currently 20 feet behind you." Isabella turned. A dark sedan parked at the curb. Engine running. She could see the exhaust in the cold air. The windows were tinted, and she couldn't see inside. Her heart was doing something specific in her chest, not racing exactly, more like hammering, with the controlled urgency of a machine that knows exactly what it's doing and is doing it as efficiently as possible. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I've made a decision about what I'm willing to do and what I'm not," the voice said. "And because the woman Lorenzo described to me this morning, the evidence she has, the people she's talked to, what she's built, in 48 hours, that's not a liability." That's a threat he created by underestimating someone for 11 years. And I'm not interested in being the last mistake he makes. The line went quiet. Then the car behind you will move in the next 60 seconds. Don't be on this street when it does. The line went dead. Nico pulled up. She got in before the door was fully stopped, pulling it closed behind her. Drive, she said now. Don't go toward the parking structure. He drove. She watched the side mirror. The dark sedan peeled away from the curb 20 seconds later and went the opposite direction, fast, deliberate, gone into the flow of traffic before she could read the plates. She sat with the phone in her hand and her heart doing that hammering thing and looked out the windshield at the city that was getting darker and colder and moving toward 9 o'clock with the absolute indifference of time that doesn't know what depends on it. What happened? Nico said. Dante Gallo just declined his instruction, she said. Nico was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, that has never happened before. I know, she said, which means Lorenzo no longer has an asset between us and the gala. Which means the only move he has left is the room, she said. He has to be in the room. It has to happen in front of everyone or not at all, because without Gallo he has no other option. She put the phone in her pocket. Outside, the city moved toward evening, and the Marchetti Gala was 3 hours away, and Lorenzo Moretti had just run out of quiet options. And the woman he'd spent 11 years reducing to a manageable size was sitting in the back of a moving car, thinking about what it meant to walk into a room where the only protection was the truth and everyone who needed to hear it was already in the room. She said it to herself once quietly, in the back of the car while the city moved toward 9 o'clock, and her heartbeat settled into something she could work with. Not calm, she wasn't calm, and she wasn't going to pretend that calm was what this required. She was present. That was different. That was enough. Nico drove without asking where. He knew where. The Marchetti event venue was on Central Park South, the kind of building that had existed long enough to have absorbed the particular gravity of rooms where powerful people made decisions that affected people who'd never been invited inside. They arrived at 8:17, 43 minutes before the formal opening, which was standard people like Lorenzo arrived early to occupy rooms before others entered them. She knew that. She decided to use it. They parked 2 blocks south. Bianca had a garment bag across her lap. She'd gone back to a safe location that afternoon and retrieved the one thing she'd said she needed, which turned out to be a dress the color of deep water. Simple, nothing that announced itself. Isabella had not changed. She was still in the coat she'd put on 2 days ago when she walked out of the courthouse. She looked at the garment bag and thought about what statement she wanted to make walking into that room and decided that the coat was the right statement. She'd left that courthouse with almost nothing. She was walking back in with everything she'd found since. She kept the coat. The files, she said to Marco in the front seat. He handed back a device slim, encrypted, already connected to the remote server that held the complete documentation package. She put it in her coat pocket next to the watch. 2 things. Everything she needed. Nico turned to look at her from the driver's seat. Once we go in, I know, she said, Lorenzo will have seen the Carbone family's attendance shift. He'll know something moved, I know. If he gets ahead of it, if he controls the room before we can. He won't, she said. Not because she was certain. Because certainty was what the next hour required, and she'd decided to supply it. He spent his whole life being the first person in every room. Tonight I'm going to get there before him. She got out of the car. They entered through the main doors at 8:22. The venue's great room was in the early stages of the evening staff moving, tables set. The bar open for early arrivals, who were mostly the kind of people who used events like this to conduct the business they couldn't conduct in business settings. The room smelled like old wood and cut flowers and money in the specific way. Money has a smell when it's been accumulating in the same places for a long time. She recognized 3 people immediately. 2 were business adjacent to Lorenzo's legitimate holdings men she'd sat across from at dinner tables and smiled at while they talked to her husband about things she wasn't meant to track. They registered her arrival with the specific blink of people encountering something unexpected and not yet sure what to do with it. The 3rd was Vincent, the Carbone representative from the afternoon meeting. He was standing near the far bar with 2 men she didn't recognize, holding a drink he hadn't touched yet. He looked at her when she came in, a small nod less than minimal, exactly calibrated. Present, watching. not yet committed to anything beyond the watching. She nodded back. She found the venue coordinator a woman with the harried efficiency of someone managing 18 things at once, and said what she needed to say clearly and without preamble. The coordinator looked at her, then at Nico, then at the small device in Isabella's hand, and made the calculation that people in service positions make when someone with a particular quality of certainty makes a request. This person knows what they're doing, and the cost of refusing is higher than the cost of complying. She made the necessary arrangements. At 8:49, Lorenzo arrived. She was standing near the center of the room when he came through the door. She'd positioned herself deliberately, not hidden, not announcing herself, simply present in a location that meant he'd see her within 30 seconds of entering. He was with a woman she didn't recognize. Naik saw someone new, younger, wearing a necklace that Isabella recognized because she'd worn it for 6 years before Lorenzo had moved it out of her jewelry case 18 months ago without saying anything about it. Pale, stones, delicate setting, her grandmother's. She watched him see her. The process took 2 seconds. First, the ambient scan of a man entering his territory, confirming the layout, clocking the familiar faces. Then the interruption, his eyes finding something that didn't fit the expected pattern. Then the recognition. Then the thing that happened in his face between recognition and recovery, which lasted less than a second, but which she'd had 11 years to learn to read. It wasn't fear. Fear wasn't his first register. It was calculation, a very fast recalibration of the room's variables. It looked from the outside like a man who'd stepped on something unexpected and recovered before anyone noticed the stumble. She stayed where she was. He handed his coat to someone and said something to the woman with him, and then moved into the room with the unhurried authority of a man who'd decided that the appropriate response to an unexpected variable is to absorb it into his existing performance. He accepted a drink. He said something to a man near the bar that made the man laugh. He moved through the space with complete apparent ease, and she tracked him, and he tracked her, and neither of them approached the other for 11 minutes. Then he came to her. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough for conversation, too far for anything private. The distance of men who want to be seen having a calm exchange. Isabella. His voice was what it always was. Smooth, modulated, carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned that warmth was a resource to be deployed strategically. I didn't expect to see you here. I know you didn't, she said. He looked at her coat. A small assessment, the coat she'd been wearing for 2 days. Slightly worn at the edge of the collar from the rain. Not appropriate for this room by the standards of rooms like this. His eyes came back to her face. You look tired, he said. I've been busy, she said. Something moved in his expression. Not much. I've heard you've been keeping interesting company. You've been keeping track. You're still my former wife. Your associations reflect on. Don't, she said. Quiet, not heated, just a flat refusal to go down that particular road. We're past the part where you manage how I'm perceived. You ended that option when you signed the papers. He looked at her for a moment. Then, because he was who he was, and he couldn't entirely help it, what do you think you're doing here? Having a conversation I should have had years ago, she said, slight. She moved. Not away from him, past him, toward the center of the room where the venue coordinator had positioned the house audio panel. Bianca appeared from the edge of the room she'd come in separately, through a different entrance, 40 minutes earlier, and had been managing her visibility carefully. Marco was near the room's main display panel. Nico was near Vincent and the Carbone representatives. Lorenzo turned to watch her move. She could feel it, the specific weight of his attention, which she'd spent years trying to be worthy of, and had finally learned was just surveillance with warmer lighting. She reached the panel. She looked at the room. 214 people, by the venue coordinator's count. She didn't know all of them, but she knew enough of them she could map, in rough terms, which nodes of Lorenzo's world were represented, which relationships could be severed by what was about to happen. Which of these people had been doing business with Lorenzo under the assumption that his organization was something it had never been? She thought about her father. One breath. Then she put the thought away and picked up the microphone the coordinator had quietly made available at the audio panel. The room took a moment to notice. People are slower to pay attention than they expect, and a woman in a plain coat picking up a microphone doesn't immediately register as an event. Then the room's ambient sound began dropping, the way it does when enough people have gone quiet that the remaining conversation becomes self-conscious. Lorenzo was 15 feet away. She could see him reading the room, reading her, running the calculation of how much of a scene he could afford and how to stop this without making it worse. He started moving toward her. Nico stepped into his path. Not blocking, exactly just present, occupying the space with the unhurried solidity of a large man who'd decided to stand somewhere specific. Lorenzo stopped. "My name is Isabella Moretti," she said into the microphone. Her voice was even. Not loud, the room was quiet enough that she didn't need loud. "Most of you know that name as it relates to Lorenzo. Some of you know me from before that, from the gallery, or from my father's work, or from the 12 years of dinners and events and conversations where I was present, but not, in any meaningful sense, participating." She paused. "I'm going to be participating now." The room was fully quiet. 3 days ago, she said, I signed divorce papers. Lorenzo had prepared them carefully. He'd spent, as it turns out, the better part of 2 years preparing them, not just the divorce, but the story that was supposed to follow it. A story about a desperate, discredited woman who'd been stealing from her husband's organization for years. A story with documentation, authenticated signatures, account records, a paper trail constructed with considerable professional skill by a man named Dario Fenn, who was paid to build a financial identity under my name that I had no knowledge of and no part in creating. She looked at Lorenzo. He was standing very still. The calculation had shifted, she could see it, the moment when he'd stopped weighing how to interrupt and started weighing what the cost of interruption would be. The room was watching. Every person in it was connected to a network. Whatever happened in this room would move through those networks before midnight. He stayed still. The purpose of that story, she continued, was to give Lorenzo a credible explanation for why $38 million is missing from pooled fund allocations that passed through his organization over the last 14 months. Money that didn't disappear. Money that was moved deliberately, systematically, into private accounts controlled by Lorenzo that his own family's financial structure has no record of. She looked at the room. At Vincent, who was watching with the stillness of a man who'd already reviewed the documentation and was now watching the live confirmation. At the Ricci representative she'd identified 30 minutes ago, a careful-faced man near the windows, who hadn't moved since she'd picked up the microphone. "I have the complete documentation. The account structures, the routing mechanism, the correspondence chain between Lorenzo and the man he paid to build it, and the technical breakdown of exactly how the fund diversions were executed." She held up the device. "All of it. Tonight Lorenzo moved. He got 3 steps before 2 things happened simultaneously." Nico shifted position, and a man from the Carbone contingent, quiet, large, the kind of large that is professional rather than incidental, appeared on Lorenzo's left side without appearing to come from anywhere in particular. Lorenzo stopped again. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something she'd never seen them do before, not fear. Still not quite fear, but the specific thing that lives adjacent to it, in a man who has never genuinely lost before and is now watching it happen in real time, with nowhere to redirect the energy. "You're making a mistake," he said, loud enough to carry. The room heard it. "I made plenty of those," she said into the microphone. "Most of them involved believing things you told me." She kept her voice level. "You told me you were a legitimate businessman who operated in difficult spaces but maintained certain principles. You told me my father's concerns about our marriage were old-fashioned and controlling. You told me closing the gallery was temporary." She paused. "You told me I was your partner." The room was very, very quiet. "You told the Carbone family, the Ricci organization, and every business associate in this room that you ran a sound operation," she said. "You told your attorneys that the missing funds originated with me. You told a man named Dante Gallo to make sure I didn't walk through the door tonight." She looked directly at Lorenzo. He declined, "which is the first honest thing anyone connected to your operation has done in longer than I can calculate." Lorenzo's face, for the first time in 11 years, was entirely unmanaged. She saw what was underneath the management, not the calculating coldness she'd learned to navigate, but something older and smaller. The face of a man who'd built his entire existence on controlling the information in every room he entered, watching the information leave his control in a room full of people he needed. "Whatever she's told you," Lorenzo said to the room, turning, attempting to reconstruct the performance. "This is a personal grievance dressed as—" "The account numbers," said Vincent. Quiet from across the room. The two words landed like something dropped from a height. We cross-referenced them this afternoon against our own records. The routing mechanism she's describing. He looked at Lorenzo with the flat, specific regard of a man who'd been doing business in difficult spaces his entire life and had very little patience left for being misled. We've seen it before. We just didn't know whose architecture it was. Lorenzo went silent. Marco connected the device to the room's display system. The screens that had been showing the event's ambient graphics shifted. Financial records, account structures. The Fen-Lorenzo correspondence, beginning with a message from 14 months ago and running to 3 weeks before the divorce. Amounts, dates. The specific damning clarity of a documented operation laid out without narration, because it didn't need narration. The room looked at the screens, then the room looked at Lorenzo. She set the microphone down. What happened next took the better part of an hour. Though she experienced it in fragments, the way you experience the aftermath of something you've built toward, which is never as clean as the anticipation. The Carbone family's representatives moved to a private room with Vincent and 3 of their men and Lorenzo's attorney, who had the haunted expression of someone who just understood the full dimensions of the position he was in. The Ricci representative made 2 phone calls in the hallway and then returned and spoke quietly with Nico for 11 minutes. Lorenzo's 2 senior men, the ones Bianca had named in her written account, the ones who'd been closest to his operational core, left the building separately, which meant they were already calculating their own positions. Men who'd built careers serving someone else's authority were very good at identifying the moment that authority was no longer protective. Lorenzo himself stood near the window for a long time. He'd stopped trying to manage the room. The room had already decided what it thought. She went to him. She didn't plan to. She'd imagined this moment a dozen times in the last 48 hours, and in none of those versions had she walked toward him voluntarily at the end of it. But she looked across the room at him, standing near the window, the silver hair, the jaw that was still sharp, the expensive coat, the man she'd spent 11 years sleeping beside and eating breakfast with and watching lie to her, so smoothly she'd almost believed it herself, and she walked over. He looked at her when she stopped beside him. His eyes were different. Still pale, still quick, but something behind them had gone out. Not remorse. She didn't think Lorenzo was capable of remorse in any way she'd recognize. More like the extinguishing of a particular kind of energy that had always been his most defining feature, the absolute, unquestionable confidence that he would find a way to make any situation work for him. "You should have let it be an ordinary divorce," she said, quietly. Not for the room wasn't listening to them anymore. Just for him. Just because it was true. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that had shed all of its performance, and was therefore more honest than anything she'd heard from him in years, "You wouldn't have been satisfied with ordinary." She thought about that, about whether it was deflection or whether it contained something real. "I would have been," she said. "You didn't give me the chance to find out." She walked away from him. Bianca was near the far end of the room, standing with a composure that looked earned rather than performed. When Isabella reached her, Bianca looked at her with an expression that had several things in it: gratitude, exhaustion, and the particular complicated thing that passes between 2 people who've been through something difficult together and don't have clean language for what that makes them to each other. "What happens to him now?" Bianca said. "The families will act on the financial evidence," Isabella said. "His organization's assets get frozen. His network loses confidence. People who built careers in his structure start making other arrangements." She paused. The federal case was already building. The Carbone audit was going to surface enough for investigators to act on. This accelerates it. "There are people in this room who will make certain calls tonight." Bianca nodded. "And the rest courts," Isabella said. "Attorneys. Time." She looked toward the window where Lorenzo was now speaking with 2 men she didn't recognize Carbone by their bearing. "Nothing fast, nothing clean. But real. Will he go to prison?" "That's not mine to determine," Isabella said. "It never was. What I had to do was make sure the truth was in the right rooms. What happens to it there? That's someone else's work." Bianca absorbed that. "That's harder than putting him away yourself." "Yes," Isabella said, "it is." Nico appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the room, the controlled dismantling of an evening that had started as Lorenzo's territory and was ending as something else entirely, with the expression of a man who'd been in difficult rooms his entire life and was making a specific accounting of this one. Samuel Rook is outside, he said. He drove down. He wanted to be available. She nodded. She'd expected that. She went out through the side entrance. The November night was cold and clean after the rain had finally stopped, and the air had that cleared quality that comes after extended water, the city smelling briefly like something other than itself. Rook was standing near the building's side door in the same cardigan and collared shirt, his overcoat open, looking up at a sky that had gone from cloud cover to actual stars in the past hour. He looked at her when she came out, the assessment she'd seen in his office, reading for how much the situation had cost, the professional habit of a man who dealt in damages. Your father would have, he started. Don't, she said. Gently. Tell me something true about him instead. Something I don't know. Rook was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and said, he used to eat lunch at the same place every Tuesday for 20 years. Bad sandwiches. Terrible coffee. He went because the man who ran it had been one of his first clients, and the business had barely survived 3 decades. And your father believed that loyalty to people who'd trusted you early was the most important kind of loyalty there was. He paused. He talked about you every time I saw him, not in the way fathers talk about children to make conversation. He talked about you the way a person talks about something they're genuinely proud of. He said you were the thing he got right. She pressed her teeth together for a moment. Breathed. Thank you, she said. He nodded. The professional composure back in place, but softer at the edges. What do you need from me? The agreement, she said. The authenticated copy from the watch. I need it formally presented through proper legal channels. The asset claim, my father's provision. I need to start that process. I can begin it tomorrow morning, he said. It will take time. These things always take time. I know, she said. I'm not in a hurry anymore. He looked at her. You're not. No. She looked up at the stars, partial, the city still eating most of them, but more than she'd been able to see in a long time. I was in a hurry for 2 days. That's done. What comes next is different work. Rook went back inside to find Nico. She stayed outside for a while. She wasn't sure how long. Long enough for the temperature to settle into her coat in earnest. Long enough for 2 vehicles to leave the building's main entrance, Lorenzo's car, without Lorenzo in it, because Lorenzo was still inside, in a room he was no longer running. Long enough for her to think about the gallery on a fall afternoon 12 years ago, the smell of fresh paint and mineral spirits, the feeling of standing in a space she'd built and understanding exactly what it was for and who it was for and what it was capable of becoming. She'd lost that. She'd let it be taken. She wasn't going to make that trade again. When she went back inside, the evening was winding toward its end in the way of events that have concluded their actual business and are now operating on ceremony's momentum. Lorenzo was no longer visible in the main room. The Carbone representatives had moved to somewhere more private. The Ricci man was gone. She found Bianca at a corner table with a glass of water she wasn't drinking and a posture that suggested she'd been sitting with something for the last 30 minutes that she hadn't yet decided what to do with. Isabella sat across from her. I'm going to need to testify, Bianca said. Not a question. Probably, Isabella said. Yes, to the families. And to investigators. Yes. Bianca turned the water glass slowly with both hands. I was with him for 2 years. I believe things he told me that I should have questioned. She looked up. I hurt people. You specifically. I sat in your home and I know, Isabella said. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not. Isabella looked at her. What you're doing right now, the account you wrote, the testimony you're going to give, the call to Felix Carr, that's what you do with what you know. That's how this works. She paused. I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven you. I don't know yet if that's the right word for what I have. But I know you made a choice when you walked out of that office building with the drive. That choice is the one that matters right now. Bianca held her gaze. Something in her face settled, not relief exactly. More like the particular resolution of a person who's been waiting to understand what's being asked of them and has finally gotten a clear answer. All right, she said. All right, Isabella said. She drove back to the West Village apartment. A loan Nico had offered, she'd declined. She needed the time in the car to be by herself, and she needed to be by herself in a way that didn't require explaining to anyone. She sat into a cab that smelled like someone's food and rain-damp upholstery, and watched the city move past, and thought about nothing demanding. The small things. The way certain blocks look at night when the foot traffic has thinned. The particular orange of New York streetlights against wet pavement. Things she'd stopped noticing at some point in the last 11 years, because you stop noticing things when you're performing constant vigilance toward a person rather than paying attention to the world. She was paying attention again. The cab stopped. She paid. She went inside. The apartment was quiet. She sat in the main room without turning on many lights, just the lamp by the window, and took the pocket watch out of her coat pocket and the device from the other pocket and set them both on the table in front of her. She sat with them for a while. Then she picked up her actual phone, the one she'd left upstairs at the brownstone 2 days ago, turned off, which Marco had retrieved and returned to her during the evening. She turned it on. Messages loaded. She didn't read them. She called Daniel Crane. He answered on the third ring. Late, but he answered because he was a practical man, and practical men answer calls from people in active situations. Isabella, he said, wary and warm in equal proportions. They pressured you off the asset case, she said. A pause. I had to make a judgment about, I understand, she said. I'm not calling about that. I'm calling because I need to restart the asset claim under my father's legal provision. There's a document authenticated, with provenance that establishes a rightful claim to assets acquired by Lorenzo using diverted funds. Samuel Rook can brief you on the details. He's in New Haven. She paused. Are you willing to take it? Silence on the line. She could hear him making his calculation, the same calculation she'd watched him make in the conference room 3 days ago, the weighing of professional risk against something else that she'd hoped he still had. Lorenzo's position, Daniel said carefully, has shifted, from what I'm understanding. Significantly, she said, tonight. Another silence. Then, send me Rook's contact information. I'll call him in the morning. Thank you, Daniel. She ended the call. She sat for a while longer with the lamp and the quiet and the cities outside doing what it always did. She thought about the 6 months ahead. The legal work slow, as Rook had said, always slow. The asset claim, the testimony, the federal case that investigators were already building and would now build faster with what had moved through the room tonight. The work of converting what had been her father's hidden documentation into something that a court could use, that families could act on, that would take the structure Lorenzo had built and dismantle it at the foundation instead of just the surface. She thought about the gallery, not as something she'd lost. She'd mourned that long enough. As something with a shape that she now understood better than she had at 30, when she built it the first time. She knew more about what she wanted it to be. She knew more about what she was willing to give up for it and what she wasn't. She knew more in general. That was what 11 years inside a life you hadn't chosen for yourself gave you, if you'd been paying attention, a very clear picture of what you actually were, as opposed to what someone else had decided you were for their own purposes. She wasn't sure that was worth what it had cost. She was sure it was something. Weeks later, Nico came to see her. She'd rented a space in the meatpacking district, not the same building. The old one had new tenants, but the same neighborhood, the same quality of afternoon light through the industrial windows that she'd spent 3 years learning to use. She was in the middle of talking to a contractor about the wall situations when Nico knocked on the open door. She finished with the contractor first, let the conversation complete, noted the necessary decisions, thanked him. Then she turned to Nico. He looked the same as he had in the car outside the courthouse. Perhaps something looser around the eyes. He stood in the middle of her empty, paint-stripped future spaces with his hands in his overcoat pockets and looked around at the exposed brick and the daylight and the measuring tape on the floor. Lorenzo's organization, she said. How far along? Federal indictment came down Tuesday, he said. Asset seizure is ongoing. Marcus Webb withdrew from representation. Last week he has his own exposure now. The 3 men closest to Lorenzo's operational core have all made arrangements with investigators. He paused. Going to trial. The families are cooperating with federal authorities to the degree it protects their own positions. Which is enough. She nodded. The asset claim, she said. Daniel and Rook filed last week. It'll take time, these things always take time. But the documentation is solid, and the opposing position has lost the ability to suppress anything. He looked at her directly. You'll get what your father intended for you. She looked at the wall the contractor was going to fix. The cracked plaster, the layers of old paint underneath, the structure that had been there longer than any of the tenants who'd used it. Good bones. That's what the contractor had said when he'd first walked through. Good bones. Needs work. Worth it. I don't need it all, she said. I need what I need to do this right. She gestured at the space. The rest goes to the legitimate businesses. There are employees people who worked for Lorenzo's legal holdings who had no knowledge of what the structure actually was. They deserve a transition, not an ending. Nico was quiet for a moment. That's going to complicate the legal claim. Then it complicates it, she said. I'm not doing this to accumulate. I'm doing this because it's what my father built it for, and because I understand, now, what he was trying to say when he built it. She looked at Nico. He wasn't trying to give me money. He was trying to give me options. I'm going to use them like that. Nico looked at her for a long moment, with that expression she'd seen the first night in the kitchen, the one that was confirmation rather than surprise. What do you need from me, he said. Nothing, she said. Don't mean that unkindly. I mean you've done what you came to do. You gave me what my father wanted me to have, and you stood in the room when it mattered. That's complete. He understood what she was saying. She could see it. And if I want to continue being useful, then be useful as yourself, she said, not as someone who's managing my situation. I'm done with people who manage my situation. She said it without heat, a statement of fact, offered clearly. If you want to invest in this, she gestured at the space again. As an investor, a real one with a real stake and a real voice. That conversation I'm willing to have. He considered it. Then the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Your father negotiated the same way. I know, she said. He taught me. She walked him to the door. The afternoon outside was cold and clear, one of those late November days that arrived occasionally like an argument against winter. The sky a sharp pale blue and the light coming in at the long angle of a season past its peak. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he'd gone, looking at the street. The meatpacking district in the afternoon had its own particular tempo. She'd forgotten that. Or not forgotten, she'd stopped paying attention. You stopped paying attention to things when you were too busy maintaining the performance of someone else's life. She pulled out the pocket watch. She turned it in her hand once. The brass worn smooth, the engraving on the back. She pressed the crown, and the case opened, and she looked at the stopped hands inside. She'd had a watchmaker reset them. She'd brought it in the week after the gala, a small shop in the West Village. A woman who'd taken it with the care of someone who understood that objects carried weight beyond their function. The hands were moving now. She closed the case, held it in her palm for a moment. The weight of it specific and familiar in the way it had become familiar. The weight of something passed from one hand to another, across a distance that had taken 6 years and 48 hours, and 11 years to close. Then she put it in her pocket and went back inside, into the stripped-down space with its good bones and its afternoon light and its absolute, uncomplicated potential, and she picked up her notebook and went back to work.